Today we find ourselves at Netley Abbey. It is in the near the south coast, not too far from Southampton. And it was, in its heyday, a Cistercian abbey, founded for the Cistercian order in 1239. The founders were a Peter de Roches, no idea, and Henry III, which would likely have been King Henry III. And it was founded in an area that was a forest, just a big forest. It sounds like, unlike many other abbeys, this didn't turn maybe into such a large metropolitan area, but it may have actually. I haven't read enough of the history yet. But anyway, the abbey was going fairly well for several hundred years. We are entering the south entrance right now, coming into the warming room. You can see there's a bit of red brick mixed in amongst the stone. That would not have been original with the abbey when it was built. Looking into the kitchen right here. In 1536, when the Reformation was happening, the abbey was given over to a William Paulet. He was a Tudor politician at the time, and so like many other monasteries and abbeys and religious institutions that were being demolished for the most part, dissolved. There's the word. This was given over to somebody, and he turned it into his manor house, which of course meant remodeling, and red brick being a very popular building tool of the Tudors. Where the improvements were made to, well, quote improvements, were done in red brick, and probably some of the repairs and shoring up the building. I mean, it was several hundred years old by the time it was turned over. We're standing in the kitchen right now, heading back out to the cloister, and we know we'll come back to what the cloister is here in a moment. Hanging a left out the west side of the building, a bit more red brick there on the floor, so that we can see the abbey from the west. There would have been a bit of building here on the right, but it's lost to history. We are approaching the entrance to the nave being the part of the church that was open to the common people. As you can see, it was very tall, like many Gothic churches. This being a medieval abbey, medieval church, would have had that styling, big, fancy window over the doors here on ground level. Approaching through into the nave, we can see now we can see all the way to the altar. Back in its day, there would have been a screen at the end of the nave, which would have been right up where the footings for those pillars. You have those four pillars in the center that would have held up the central tower. The choir screen, as they call it, would have been on this side of those pillars, and it would have blocked off the choir and the altar, those being spaces that only the monks were allowed to visit. Walking down the nave into the choir here. As you can see, I wasn't the only person there exploring this fantastic ruin and bit of religious history here in Great Britain. It would have been the north transept, little part of the left-hand arm of the cross, since the churches were all shaped like crosses. That would be the south transept. And this area we're entering was the apartments for William Paulet when he had converted this house into a manor house. But what we're looking at here actually is his modifications removed, and we're looking at the remains of the abbey. This here was an area where there would have been storage for important relics and such for the church. This area in front of us that we're walking through, this was a bookstore. not where you would buy books, but where you would store books. Again, the cloister would have been surrounded by a covered walkway where the monks would be able to walk for contemplation, to pray, to work. This here is the chapter house. This would have been the primary meeting room, meeting space of the monastery, where important things would be discussed during the day. This would have been just an entrance. Now this is the misericord, which I just recently learned is an area of the abbey where the rules of the abbey would have been relaxed a bit. So, whereas in much of the space maybe the monks weren't allowed to talk too much, here they would have had a bit more freedom to converse and such. This here we're entering into. This is an outdoor, this is the outside of the infirmary. That is the water source. It actually is flowing slowly, and probably would have been a bit less polluted back in the day than it is now, which is saying something, considering the water quality at the time. This here is the infirmary. Would have been where the monks came to heal, I guess. The big fireplace there would have kept it warm, although it could be an addition because of all the red brick. Maybe that was added by the Paulette who owned the abbey for a while. Again, we had the water for the abbey flowing by. And here we're trying to look up too. You can see there's another set of windows above. Above the infirmary and also above the misericord would have been the dormitory, where the monks would have slept when they were all living here at the time. We can see that was the altar there from outside. We are now walking over to the abbot's lodging. The abbot being the person in charge of the abbey in this case, or an abbess. They did exist. If the abbey was populated by nuns, you would have an abbess running the place, and that is what they did. The abbot ran the place, kind of like the CEO of a corporation. It was their job to keep it paying for itself. The church really did have to pay for itself, which was part of why it was granted so much land, which it could then farm. Have other people farm in order, and then the goods would be sold, and they would collect taxes, and they would operate just like a business or a rich member of the aristocracy. Only the difference being that it was a house of God and not a house of rich person. Coming here around the back of the abbot's lodging, just to kind of show it's a bit of a U-shaped building. Would have probably had maybe have had a second floor. Just based on what we're seeing, but it would have been pretty good size, all things considered. When they're supposed to give up their worldly goods. On the other hand, they did have to impress the aristocracy. The abbeys and monasteries and churches and such were where the aristocracy would often stay when they were traveling. If they were trying to get to the continent or back or just around the country and they needed somewhere to stay temporarily, it would have been typically at a monastery. And coming back out to get a view of the altar from the east, and that is Netley Abbey.